Okay. Well, I think I will just admit that Christian worship music is probably the area of Christian culture that I know the least by far. Of the things I know about, the very few things I know about, that's one of the areas I just don't pay attention to. I know I'm learning a new worship song in the church, seems like every single Sunday, so I know there's a lot of activity on this front. But maybe you could walk us through, like, how, who is writing the worship songs that we're hearing. I say we like I'm somebody who listens to this music, but that someone might hear or that they might be singing in church. And how does it get from that songwriter to the worship leader to the worship, session, the worship of the church itself?
Sure. Well,
and by and large, I guess we'd have to say.
Yeah, I was going to say there is no unified path. So like, we'll have to speak in generalities, and we'll also have to say, like, I don't know what kind of church you go to on Sundays. So like, you could be one of the millions, approaching billions of Christians who show up at churches, and the songs that they hear are ones that they're reading out of a book, that was been in the back of their pews. And even that, as we know, was at one point in time an innovation, right? So every single strain along the way was like, somebody wrote the Psalms even. So every song was written. However, probably what you're alluding to is like in the 21st century, in whatever you want to say, Western, North American, probably actually just mostly evangelical culture, there is a pattern where we have a lot of worship songs, and they're kind of coming fast and furious at us. So how do they get there? How are they getting there? And they can, like I said, there's no unified path. So for example, at your church, you could have a young woman or young lady, or an old woman or old lady, who are writing these songs, and they could be like, hey, let's go ahead and lead this song. This happens all the time, right? Mm-hmm. However, if that's the case, this is probably then not the same song that's being led across the street, across town, across the state, or across the world, right? So for the songs that are kind of, for lack of a better word, maybe penetrating the market, for like the songs that are like, hey, I know that song because I heard it either on the radio or at Chick-fil-A or at one of the 3 churches that I visit.
Wait, is that possible that I could actually hear this as the Muzak in Chick-fil-A?
Oh, do you go to, I don't know. Is there a Chick-fil-A in Holland?
There is a Chick-fil-A in Holland. There's exactly one, and yes. I've only been through the drive-through, so.
Okay, so if you quieted your heart as you approached the drive-through and maybe quieted your electric vehicle, if you hear music from in there, it will be worship music. They do play worship music.
I did not know that. Okay.
Usually instrumental worship music. This is my understanding. Okay. But it would nonetheless be the melody, which is copyrightable, of these songs, right? So how do these songs, how do they kind of like the ones that are in the ether, the ones that you're like, I don't even know where I heard this, but I know this song. How does it happen? Research seems to indicate that more and more these are songs that are being kind of intentionally written and by cohorts of people rather than individual people. So, and I don't know, I feel like I should say, I say this all the time because it makes me feel better about myself. I'm not an expert in this, but I work with people who are experts in this.
You do work with a consortium of people who study how worship music makes
legitimate PhDs in this stuff. Like they do. I just happen to be, they let me hang around, and I do a lot of the writing, and sometimes I get coffee and stuff. So one of the ways that people track how these songs are kind of like making an impact in the market is by something called CCLI. So that's church. It's either church or Christian. I think it's Christian. Copyright Licensing International. So it's like it's a copyright company that was started as a ministry of a church back in the 1980s, and now has evolved into being quite a large company, and we could talk about the mechanics in the back end, but the bottom line is they release charts, kind of like Billboard charts people might be familiar with. And they kind of give us, not just the people in the pews, but academics and people who study this stuff, they give us not a perfect, but the best kind of snapshot that we have of the market and how these things are playing out. So if you look at those charts and you kind of look like, well, what's happening right now? We've seen that over the last couple of decades, what used to be normative, or very, very often you would have kind of single authored songs, single or maybe two people authored, but very often single authored songs that would kind of be birthed probably in a local church or by a worship leader, and they would just kind of catch fire and they would just move up through the ranks, as it were.
Sorry, when you say catch fire, do you mean within that church, or do you mean it's already been distributed through some kind of music distribution network?
Yeah. Let's put we'll put a parenthesis.
Okay.
We can come back on that. So maybe a little bit more homegrown kind of stuff that was still making its way around the country, around the world. Now, more often than not, you'll see 4, 5, 6 songwriters on songs. And I noticed it. So I teach at a university in Sussex, New Brunswick, Canada, which is where I am right now. I just finished a class. And this morning during our chapel, one of the things that maybe they do at your church, or maybe they don't, I don't know, but at the end of a song that's one of these modern songs, it's best practice, which is super weird, but it's best practice to like project at the end of the song onto the screen either the songwriters, really it's the publishing is what you're supposed to be doing, because we're saying, hey, like we paid for this song, we have the rights. Just like if you had a hymnal, there would be copyright material in that hymnal and somebody will have been appropriately compensated for that. So because we don't have it printed, we project it like you're supposed to project it when you do it. So I was looking at the end of one of these songs, and it was just an absolute paragraph of publishing companies, right? Like it was like 6 or 7 publishing companies. And this is indicative of the fact that there's multiple writers, and then sometimes these writers even have multiple publishing kind of arrangements or whatever to do that. So that's one of the shifts that you've seen over the last number of decades, is that it's moved from I guess what people would in their heads maybe perceive as being like a song being laid on someone's heart to frankly constructed material, like very intentionally crafted material that's kind of supposed to hit a need, I guess, for the market. I mean, we could get into the mechanisms of how it goes from like a songwriting room in Nashville to a church in Michigan or in New Brunswick, Canada. But I mean, it's probably not difficult to imagine how some of that stuff happens. We're talking right now over the internet, right? Like there's so many different ways.
It's difficult for me. So I do want to come back to that. Yes. I want to go first to a phrase that you kind of threw out there is songs that penetrated the market. And so I guess part of my confusion, and this is genuine confusion for me, I just don't understand how the whole system works, is the market churches singing these songs, or is the market radio play, or is the market YouTube videos watching, or is that it's all of that, just like a lot of music? So when I write a song today, I'm a single author, like Matt Redman is one guy, I always remember his name. Chris Tomlin and those kinds of guys. I write a song, and I want other people to sing it. So penetrating the market, what does that look like if you say there's this song has deeply penetrated the market? What do you actually mean by that? Yeah.
Hey there, if you've benefited from this content at all, please hit the like and subscribe, or subscribe and like, one of those or both of them together on this video. It helps us tremendously with the math algorithm nerd monsters.
Well, it depends if you're Matt Redman or Michael W. Smith,
okay.
Which two names that you might know, right? So obviously Michael W. Smith became somebody who became known as somebody who's a worship artist, but for the first couple decades of his career, he was what we call a CCM artist. So terms are CCM, so contemporary Christian music.
Okay. I was like, country and Mesmer? No.
Yeah. Terms are notoriously slippery in these spheres. So like I often, in the work that we do, we often kind of get asked, why is more like black gospel music not represented in our genre studies and stuff? And I only bring that up to say, they will often, when I'm having conversations with somebody who are very interested in black gospel music, they will just call the other stuff, the stuff that we're talking about, they'll call it CCM all the time, contemporary Christian music.
Okay.
And I say, okay, I know what you mean by that. Or I think it took me a long time, but now it's like, okay, I think I understand what you mean by that. But when we say CCM, so people who are in my city, we mean performance music that's intended to be listened to. Things like, things that you would hear on the radio, but things that you would hear on the radio that you would not next Sunday potentially sing in your church.
Yeah,
Right?
we
So this
should
is-
come back to this issue of whether
yes.
worship music is performance or not. Yeah, okay, but
That'd be
we'll
great.
set that to the side
Yeah.
for a second. Yeah.
So the terms are kind of slippery. So one that we often end up using is contemporary praise and worship.
Okay.
Ruth and Lim wrote a book about that a couple years ago, and that kind of helps. So CWM, contemporary worship music, sometimes people call it. Anyway, let's just call it church music. So
Okay.
songs that you do in church, right? If your hope is to have songs done in church, then when we say market saturation, what we mean, are they being led in churches? You could have 1 billion views on YouTube. That wouldn't mean that they're being led in churches. Now, it does mean that now.
Right.
Because
Right.
if you have 1 billion views on YouTube, then you know that people in your church are watching it. And so they're asking you to lead it. And they know that you as a worship leader have been listening to it, and you probably want to lead it. And your pastor's like, hey, that church seems to be like crushing it. Why don't we do that song too? Right. So there are, what they call market drivers, things that drive you towards it. But at the end of the day, if your stated purpose is to lead people, that the song is going to be useful in congregational worship for people, then it wouldn't matter if you were the number one song on Spotify if people weren't leading it in congregations, right? And also how the money breaks down is there are different royalty kind of arrangements that are based upon performance of songs versus recordings of songs, right? So CCLI, which we referred to earlier, is not interested in songs being played on YouTube and Spotify. They're not looking for that. The only thing they're looking for is our local congregations leading these songs on a Sunday morning. That's all they're interested in.
And are they paying the copyright to do that, which you pay a subscription fee to CCLI or something that covers?
That's right. Which you
their
don't have to.
catalog music.
You don't have to do. If you're like, no, I want out of the system. I don't want to do that. You could break the law, or you could just say, I want to individually every Sunday tally up the songs that I did, and I want to send a certain amount of copy.
Yeah.
Like it's so like copy CCLI in performance world. There's like CSAC and ASCAP and other BMI large acronyms that I can't tell you what they all stand for, but their performance right in Canada, it's called SOCAN. I can tell you that.
Okay.
They're performance rights agencies, and they're just, all they're doing is they're brokers, right? They're kind of trying to cut out the middleman. Like, so I'm not listening to the radio in every province 24 hours a day trying to look for where my song is done.
Right.
Like, we have people that do that, and so that's what CCLI is there to do, is to purportedly exist as a bridge between local churches to keep them compliant, and also to help resource both the songwriters and the churches themselves.
And lest people think this sounds way too businessy, and maybe it is for some people. There's a great YouTube channel called Selling Jesus by a friend of mine who's talking about some very interesting things when it comes to copywriting. I think
I didn't know he was a friend of yours. Yeah, he's been. We've been cross-referenced from time to time. So.
Yeah. But as you pointed out, a hymnal is also a copyrighted document, and so every time you're opening the hymnal, some fee has been paid to somebody so that you can do that.
Bibles are copyrighted.
Yeah, Bibles are very heavily copyrighted, and
Well, that's way
defended.
worse, man.
Yeah, I mean, when I quote, I often translate on my own because I can't handle the translations that are out there. But yeah, if you're quoting, you can only quote so many verses before you have to start paying for it, right? So yeah, everything is copyrighted kind of in this world. And whether that is moral, immoral, biblically aligned or not is a whole separate conversation. That's the world as we find it here. At least thinking of worship content. So if you have somebody who has written that song, then yeah, how does it? So it's somebody in Nashville, or a group of people sit down to write a song in Nashville, and it probably will be in Nashville or California. There's only going to be, I think as you guys found in your research, there really is just 4 or 5 powerhouse writing teams or places that crank out a lot of what we consider modern worship music.
Yeah, that was a
contemporary worship music. CWM.
Right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, that's a snapshot at the end of the 2020s. Here we are halfway through or at the beginning of the 2020s. Here we are halfway through the decade. I mean, is it possible that the landscape has shifted? Yes, but it's not been deconstructed. Put it that way. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you're listening to a song, or sorry, you're singing a song in your church. Let's go back to the worship setting, and that song was one that was on Christian radio or made popular somehow. It's likely that there's a select group of people who wrote that song, rather than. And I think even in the 80s and 90s, at the church I went to, a charismatic non-denominational church, they were very proud that a lot of their worship leaders wrote. I mean, I don't know half the songs, but some percentage of the songs were written by the people who were the worship leaders in that church. And then they were always proud when they heard that same song, performed by some other church in St. Louis or whatever. Okay. So it goes from the writing room to where? I assume there's some kind of production of the song in a studio somewhere. And then who's got their hands on this? Are there managers and marketing teams involved trying to push certain songs? I noticed some of the stuff that you've been putting out. I don't understand why, but you thought it was very significant that a lot of songs come out as singles rather than albums. So I'd be interested in hearing what's the difference here?
Sure. Well, again, there's no unified path. And part of the research that you alluded to from when we looked at the decade, the 2010s all the way to 2020, one of the things that we noticed was that all the top 25 songs. So CCLI releases top 100 lists. Those lists have recently changed, which is actually the most recent article that we just put out, but not in a way that will make much difference to the average person. That's kind of, like I said, kind of inside baseball detail
right.
stuff. But nonetheless, people understand, hey, top 100, top 25. What people don't always understand about the difference between a top 26 song and a top 19 song, or it's really in the top 5. It's quite a parabola. So you can have a top 25 song and still need to eat Kraft dinner or mac and cheese, whatever you call it in the US. But when you get up in those top 3, 2, 1, that's when all of a sudden you don't need to. You can have some steak for the
some real money coming in on that song.
So it's just a dramatic difference in terms of those things. So we looked at just at the top 25 and isolated all the songs in top 25 for that decade, and we had to justify our work in some respects, but we feel justified in saying that all of them were linked to a handful of what we call megachurches, the big four. And so when I say there's no unified path from the songwriting room to your local congregation, there isn't. But one of the things that at least was a huge impact during that time was churches, actually. These churches, they were the ones who would popularize these songs. So even if they were written by people, this is the idea of there were 3 or 4 songs. People said, well, guys, those songs weren't written by those churches. There's a song that you might know called Great Are You, Lord by All Sons and Daughters. If I sang it for you right now, you probably recognize it, but I won't put you through that. If Bruce Benedict is listening, he'll be grateful.
Bruce does listen to this podcast. So.
Love you, Bruce. Yeah. But that song there was hey, that was written by he's I know these people. That wasn't written by the church that we said that popularized it, which was Bethel Church. But if you look at the charts, the song was middling until it was performed, to use that word, led at Bethel Church. And then a viral video of that went. And then the notoriety, the authority, whatever you want to say, the cool factor, just the relevance of that church, we argue, tipped the song into the public consciousness enough that it became a song. So we say it became popularized by that. So the kind of key thing for that decade was people were looking to these churches as tastemakers for what the songs were. So you're right. The song gets written. It needs to be recorded because most people, I've led worship for 25 years and I can't read sheet music. So if you give me a sheet music, I'm not leading that song. I need to hear it. I read it chords, but I need to hear. So we need a recording of the song for sure, but it's not the recording. It's not the fact that it's available. It's how people are engaging with it, how they're introduced to the song that makes a big difference. And so part of our research was about, well, what is it then that tips the scales for people to make them say, this is a song that I think we should lead in our local church. So I think that's actually, again, there are mechanisms that take it from the songwriting room to your church, but it's actually much more about not just the paths, but the engine, what's driving it and why. Yeah.
Yeah. So the big four are Bethel, Hillsong, Who else?
Passion City Church, which is actually it is a church, but it started off as a conference, Passion Conference.
Okay.
And Elevation.
Elevation. Okay.
Yeah.
I've heard of all those except for Passion City.
Yeah.
And so I think about, again, just to go a generation ago, 25, 30 years ago, it's not that there weren't powerhouse worship music being put out there in the public sphere. I just think if I were a worship leader, let's say 50 years ago, I was a worship leader of a church, probably be doing hymnals, and maybe depending on where the church was in the Jesus movement, maybe I'd be doing some of the more popular spirituals of the day. But I'm curating, I'm thinking of like what we should be doing versus now, and you may not think this is a big deal at all, or you can help norm the data here for me, versus now, as you said, a bunch of people in my church that listen to worship music and buy all this music might be saying, hey, why aren't we playing this song? Or we should be playing this song. It seems like almost the same pressure that you get from, I call it the Tim Keller effect in the Presbyterian church, where like, hey, I heard a sermon by Tim Keller. Why don't, almost like this, why don't you preach like that kind of
Right.
assumption there? So
Yeah.
is that is that a caricature, or is that a real pressure that worship leaders face that maybe they didn't in the past?
Oh, I think so for sure. Yeah. So we mentioned earlier about like the distinction between like performance music and worship music. And so we're CCM and CWM, whatever. Yeah. I mean, it used to be that Christian radio, which I'm studying this as a Canadian. Christian radio was never big in Canada, but I mean,
Right.
it was quite a large thing in the United States, I understand, and it still exists, but its influence is waning.
Yeah.
But if you look at the decade that we're talking about, that was around the time when CCM as a genre, some people will argue, I don't have the receipts to show you this right now, but it's relatively widely accepted that like CCM died. Because like growing up, I used to listen to tons of like safe and fun for everyone, family friendly music. That was like if you like this band, you're going to like this Christian equivalent.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about? Like
Yeah.
I had all of them.
Perfume versions and bands. Yeah.
I had them all. I bought all the cassette tapes. I bought all the CDs. Like I was way into it. But that heyday kind of died sometime around the early 2000s for a couple of different reasons. But one of them is that worship music, they say video killed the radio star, but worship music killed the contemporary Christian music star. And it's like when you turned on the same dial locations that you used to, what you heard now mostly was worship music.
Yeah.
Which is something you in the 90s you would not have heard Maranatha stuff on those stations. I mean, you could have found stations that played it, but that wasn't
Right.
what the CCM stations were playing. They were playing, light rock, and they were playing like the substitute hip hop stuff or whatever. Like that's what they were playing. So then, but for some reason, worship music as a genre, which is also a complicated thing to say, as an aesthetic package, that kind of music took over the radio waves. So at the same time as the internet was also making it just, ubiquitously available to people via YouTube and via Spotify playlists and, all these other things. So all of these things are colliding so that one point in time, like a friend of mine who was a worship leader when I was a late teenager, early 20s, he would kind of like, he was like a specialist. Like he was like a curator, right? Like he'd be like, they used to send CDs in the mail about like, here's like 20 new worship songs you could think about or whatever. And he could kind of listen through them and be like, oh, it's interesting. Well, like, but it was like a magic 8-ball that he was behind. Like no one else had access to this stuff. Right? No one was combing the internet for this. Whereas now, I would get once a week, I would at least get somebody sending me a Facebook message where it would be like, dude, check this one out. You're going to love this. We got to leave this on Sunday. And so, yeah, it 100% the direction has changed in terms of where the pressure is coming from.
And this coming back to this issue of performance song versus worship song versus hymn. Now, and correct me if I'm wrong. I'm way over my skis here, but I think of a performance song like Michael W. Smith, Stephen Curtis Chapman, Anne Murray,
Canadian treasure,
Amy
Grant.
Thank you, Amy Grant. People who are writing pop songs of various sorts, maybe Petra, pushing over into rock, and I'm trying to think of the yellow and black striped guys, striper.
You said it. You had it there. Yeah.
But okay, so these are songs that you would go to a concert to hear a performance of these songs, and you might sing along to them like you would a Taylor Swift song, right? And then you have worship songs, and one of the critiques I've heard, maybe coming out of my own mouth at times, is that a lot of worship music now is actually much more like performance music, in the sense that it's very difficult if you've never heard the song before. And I have this experience week to week as I'm having to kind of learn the newest song, that there's not really any way to anticipate outside of standard chord progressions what the actual lyrics of the song is going to do in the way that a hymn performs, where like a hymn starts out with like, let me play for you really quickly what you're getting ready to sing. And now you're going to sing that 4 times, right? So do you see any space between those types of music, or do you just see them as all like worshipable? You just got to be amenable to what's going on, or like functionally speaking, as a worship leader, how do you judge those different songs and how you employ them?
Yeah. I can't wait to see how you tie this to the Old Testament. This is going to be a real judo move for you.
Yeah.
So yeah, obviously you get asked this all the time, like what makes a song a worship song? And so, the tradition that I grew up in was a very broadly evangelical tradition. I'm no longer the worship pastor of this church, but I still periodically will lead worship at a church that is, by Canadian standards, a megachurch. You have 1,000 people there in front of you.
That's by Dru standards. That's a megachurch too.
Yeah. Well, but I've also been in smaller, I've been in all different kinds of contexts. And so, but I mean to say, like, this is the denomination and the tradition in which I was formed. And so for us, we're very pragmatic. Like, I mentioned this book earlier. I just happen to have it right here. It's such a good book. You should see it. It's a history of contemporary praise and worship.
Okay.
It's good. You should really check it out. And they kind of, it's a wonderful metaphor that they kind of paint, which is that there's these 2 different streams of worship that's come up in the 20th century. And these 2 streams end up colliding into kind of a giant river, which brings us the landscape that we have today. And the 2 streams are praise and worship music, which is kind of like essentially the Pentecostal tradition that, broadly speaking, and then contemporary worship. So I was in a contemporary worship church. So in other words, our whole thing was, let's speak the language of the culture, right? Like, let's do everything we can to, in the same way that missionaries are doing their best to read the culture that they're heading into, in the same way that Bible translators are doing their best to take the original meanings and then make them relevant to the new reader, we should take our worship practices and we should translate them from one culture to another. So in that view, you essentialize everything. You bring it down to like, well, okay, it's not the practices, it's not the edges. What's the core, and then how can I apply it into the world? It seems like a bit of a diatribe. I'm good at diatribes. The point is that if you ask in that context, well, what makes a song a worship song, or what makes it a congregational song? It's like, are you leading it on Sunday morning for people to sing along to? Right. Then congratulations, you got yourself a worship song, right? That's what does it. Now you could say the content matters too. Like if you got up and said, everybody on the count of 3, kumbaya, or row, row, row your boat. Let's 4-part harmony. Let's sing it together. That wouldn't make it a worship song, but nor is it the content only. It's the context in which it's dropped. If you drop it into a worship service in the hopes that other people will sing it with you, because if they're not going to sing it with you, it's called a special, right? That's a contemplative piece. But if you want multiple voices,
right,
and it's going to be about or pointing towards Jesus in some way, congratulations, Dru, you got yourself a worship song.
All right.
So in that context, then you don't have to, like, it's not about like, well, is it maximally or minimally singable?
Right.
Is the theology good? Is the theology bad? Like, those are questions that you can ask, but they are not what's going to make or break as whether it's a worship song. It's kind of like, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, then quack, quack, you got yourself a duck.